February 1st, 1966, approximately 30 miles inside Laos. Lieutenant Junior Grade Dieter Dengler felt the impact before he heard it. His A-1 Skyraider shuddered as anti-aircraft fire tore through the fuselage during a classified interdiction mission near the Mujia Pass. The 28-year-old Navy pilot from Attack Squadron 145, flying off the USS Ranger, had been the last man to roll in on the target. Due to limited visibility from smoke rising off burning fields, his squadron mates lost sight of him in the haze. The controls went dead in his hands. Years later, Dengler would describe that moment with characteristic understatement. "I knew I was going down. The only question was whether I'd survive the landing." He did survive. The crash landing in dense Laotian jungle left him bruised but alive. Within 48 hours, he would be captured by Pathet Lao forces. What followed would become one of only 2 successful prisoner escapes by American airmen during the entire Vietnam War. Dengler spent his first night in the jungle attempting to evade capture. He had deliberately smashed his survival radio and hidden most of his survival equipment to prevent enemy forces from finding it. On the second day, while attempting to signal rescue aircraft flying overhead, he was apprehended by Pathet Lao troops near a spring where he had stopped to drink. The torture began immediately. As punishment for his failed escape attempt, Dengler was hung upside down by his ankles with a nest of biting ants positioned directly over his face until he lost consciousness. He was then suspended in a freezing well overnight, positioned so that if he fell asleep, he would drown. During forced marches through villages over the following week, he was dragged behind a water buffalo. When he refused to sign a Pathet Lao document condemning United States involvement in Southeast Asia, his captors escalated the punishment. Slivers of bamboo were methodically inserted under his fingernails. Additional bamboo wedges were driven into incisions cut into his body, left to fester in the tropical heat. Dengler refused to sign. Years later, he explained his grandfather had been the only citizen in his German hometown who refused to vote for Adolf Hitler, enduring public humiliation and forced labor for that refusal. That memory sustained him through torture. He would not break. After 7 days of interrogation, Dengler was handed over to Vietnamese forces and transported to a prisoner of war camp near the village of Par Kung in Laos. When Dengler arrived at the jungle-shrouded POW camp, 6 other prisoners were already there. Air Force First Lieutenant Dwayne Martin, a helicopter pilot shot down in September 1965. Eugene Jean de Bruin, an Air America civilian crew member who had bailed out of a burning cargo plane in September 1963. Thai civilians Prasit Promsuan, Prasit Thani, and Fisit Intherathat, also Air America crew members, and YC2, a Hong Kong native. The civilians had been held by the Pathet Lao for 2.5 years by the time Dengler joined them. They had survived conditions that defied human endurance. The camp was a crude collection of bamboo huts surrounded by jungle, guarded by Pathet Lao forces, who were themselves barely surviving. A severe drought had created desperate food shortages throughout the region. The guards were starving. The prisoners were dying slowly. The routine of captivity followed a brutal, unchanging pattern. Morning began around 9 a.m. when guards brought rice. On better days, all 7 prisoners were allowed to eat together at a crude wooden table outside the main hut. They had approximately 10 minutes to talk before guards shouted "Quo, quo," and physically shoved them back inside the bamboo structure. The meal itself was barely sustenance, a single handful of rice divided among 6 or 7 men. Sometimes it was watery broth. Other times, the rice was simply handed out raw or partially cooked. This morning ration represented the only reliable food the prisoners would receive all day. During mid-morning and early afternoon, the heat became unbearable. Temperatures inside the hut soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The prisoners sat in near darkness, conserving energy, trying not to move. Movement meant sweating. Sweating meant dehydration. Dehydration meant death. Around mid-afternoon, guards would wake from their heat-induced stupor. They checked animal traps scattered through the jungle and foraged for edible leaves and bark. Some days they found rats or small animals. The prisoners watched hungrily as guards cooked these discoveries for themselves. By 5 o'clock, guards would open the huts again for a second 10-minute meal. Then the prisoners were returned to their confinement for the night. At night, conditions worsened. Each prisoner's feet were locked into wooden foot blocks, crude restraints that prevented movement. The prisoners were also handcuffed together, wrist to wrist, creating a chain that ensured if one man tried to escape, all would be discovered. The foot blocks were heavy, roughly carved pieces of wood with holes bored through them. Each prisoner's ankles were inserted through the holes. Then a wooden peg was driven through to lock them in place. The blocks chafed and created open sores that became infected in the tropical climate. But the prisoners had learned a crucial skill. By melting down the few toothpaste tubes they possessed, they had fashioned crude keys. These keys could open the locks on the foot blocks. Each night, once guards settled into their routines, prisoners would quietly free themselves. This gave them precious hours to plan, to whisper, to maintain the sanity that complete immobilization would have destroyed. The single handful of rice shared among 6 or 7 men provided perhaps 100 to 150 calories per person daily. Human beings require approximately 2,000 calories daily to maintain basic bodily functions. The prisoners were receiving less than 10% of that requirement. To supplement this starvation diet, the prisoners ate rats. The Laotian jungle was home to numerous rat species. The prisoners became expert rat hunters. They learned to recognize rat runs, the paths rats used repeatedly through the underbrush. They set crude traps using materials scavenged from the camp. They waited motionless for hours for an opportunity to grab a rat by hand. When they caught a rat, it was consumed almost entirely. The fur was singed off over small fires. The meat was roasted or boiled. The organs were eaten. The bones were cracked and the marrow sucked out. Nothing was wasted. A single rat might provide an additional 200 to 300 calories, split among the prisoners who caught it. The physical effects of starvation manifested quickly. Within the first month, Dengler lost approximately 30 pounds. His body began cannibalizing muscle tissue to maintain basic organ function. His face became gaunt, skull-like. His eyes sank into dark hollows. His ribs became clearly visible beneath skin that seemed to shrink around his skeleton. The mental effects were worse. Starvation produces a constant, overwhelming obsession with food. Every waking thought centered on eating. The prisoners talked endlessly about meals they remembered, restaurants they had visited, foods they would eat when freed. Dengler later described the psychological deterioration. You start to hallucinate. You see food everywhere. A leaf looks like lettuce. Tree bark looks like bread. You have to constantly remind yourself that these things aren't real food, that eating them won't help. But your mind keeps insisting they are food, keeps trying to convince you to eat them. Malnutrition destroys the immune system. The prisoners, already weakened by starvation, became vulnerable to every disease present in the tropical environment. Chronic dysentery affected all 7 prisoners. The disease produces severe diarrhea, abdominal pain, and further dehydration. The prisoners were forced to relieve themselves in bamboo containers kept inside the huts. Every second or third day, one prisoner would carry these containers outside to empty them, running the risk of being shot by guards. Malaria infected all the prisoners. Without prophylactic medications or treatment, the prisoners endured repeated cycles of fever, chills, and delirium. Dengler developed 2 distinct strains of malaria simultaneously, each producing its own cycle of symptoms every few days. Intestinal parasites became universal. Roundworms, hookworms, and other parasites infected the prisoners through contaminated food and water. These parasites competed with the prisoners for whatever minimal nutrition they consumed, further accelerating starvation. Some prisoners reported passing worms that were 6 to 8 inches long. Fungal infections covered the prisoners' bodies. The combination of constant humidity, poor hygiene, and weakened immune systems created ideal conditions for fungal growth. Dengler also developed jaundice and hepatitis, causing liver damage that would persist long after rescue. From the moment of his arrival, Dengler focused on escape. Eugene, who had been imprisoned longest, had already been planning escape attempts. But previous plans had fallen apart due to disagreement among prisoners about timing and methodology. Some prisoners, weakened by years of captivity, doubted they possessed the strength to survive escape into the jungle. Dengler brought new energy to the planning process. His Navy survival school experience, where he had successfully escaped from mock POW camps twice, provided methodologies the other prisoners had never considered. The prisoners began systematic preparations. First, they loosened a large support pole in the American hut by pouring water and urine at its base. Night after night, they worked the pole back and forth, gradually breaking down the earth that held it. Eventually, they could lift the entire pole out of the ground, creating a gap in the hut structure. Next, they loosened logs near the floorboards at specific points, creating a hidden exit route. During daytime, they carefully replaced everything to appear normal. But at night, they could quickly remove these components and slip through. Dengler personally dug a hole under the fence adjacent to the hut. He excavated dirt at night, carrying it away in small quantities to avoid detection. Once the hole was large enough to crawl through, he covered it with leaves and bamboo, making it invisible to casual inspection. The prisoners identified weapon storage locations. They noted that before guards went to eat, they routinely left weapons unattended. A Thompson submachine gun was left in the guard tower. Chinese-made rifles were stored on the porch of the guard hut. An American M1 carbine with a full 15-round magazine was kept in the same location. They made scale models of the camp using bamboo scraps and dirt, studying layouts and planning escape routes. They rehearsed their plan in whispers, assigning specific roles to each prisoner. The original target date was July 4th, 1966. But in mid-June, circumstances changed dramatically. One afternoon in mid-June, the Thai prisoners overheard a conversation between guards. The guards were discussing their desperate situation. The drought had created such severe food shortages that they were struggling to feed themselves, let alone the prisoners. The guards had decided on a solution. They would take the prisoners into the jungle, shoot them, and claim they had been killed during an escape attempt. This would eliminate the burden of feeding 7 additional people. When the Thai prisoners relayed this information, the decision became immediate. The prisoners could not wait until July 4th. They had to escape before the guards implemented their plan. The prisoners agreed to move the escape up to June 29, 1966. June 29, 1966. The morning began like any other. Guards opened the huts around 9 a.m. for the morning rice ration. The prisoners ate their handful of rice, performing the same routine they had followed for months. Nothing in their behavior suggested this day would be different. Around noon, the duty guards began preparing their own meal. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. The guards gathered to eat, focused on their food, weapons set aside. Dengler gave the signal. He leapt onto the porch of the guard hut. The bamboo flooring creaked with his every step. Inside, he found 2 Chinese-made rifles and the American M1 carbine with a full 15-round magazine. His hands, weakened by months of starvation, shook as he grabbed the M1. On his way out, he grabbed a full ammunition belt with extra magazines. As he came off the porch, the other prisoners were already emerging through the hole under the fence. De Bruin was moving toward the gun tower where the Thompson submachine gun was stored. Pathet and Parasites came toward Dengler, who handed them the loaded Chinese rifles and ammunition. De Bruin reached the gun tower and grabbed the Thompson. Then the first shots rang out. The prisoners encountered at least 5 guards as they exited their confinement area. The guards, caught completely by surprise with their weapons out of reach, scrambled for cover. Dengler raised the M1 and fired. The recoil nearly knocked him backward. His weakened muscles could barely control the weapon. But the guards had no weapons at all. In those crucial 60 seconds, 5 guards were killed in the shootout. The other guards fled into the jungle. 7 prisoners, armed with captured weapons and minimal supplies, fled into the Laotian jungle. The prisoners had always planned to split into groups to maximize chances that someone would survive. 3 groups formed almost immediately. Dengler and Dwayne Martin headed together toward the Mekong River. Their plan was to reach the river, follow it downstream to Thailand, and find American forces, De Bruin and YC, to headed in a different direction. The 3 Thai prisoners formed the 3rd group. This decision, made in seconds amid gunfire and chaos, determined their fates. Of the 7 prisoners who escaped, only 2 would survive. Dengler and Martin moved as quickly as their weakened bodies allowed. They crashed through dense undergrowth, fighting through vines and thorns that tore at their skin. Neither man was wearing shoes. Their feet began bleeding within the first hour. They moved for several hours, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the prison camp. By evening, exhaustion overwhelmed them. They had not eaten since the morning rice ration. Their bodies had no reserves for this level of exertion. They collapsed near a stream. The next day, they began searching for the Mekong. They found a fast-flowing river and decided to follow it. Dengler proposed building a raft. Using bamboo and vines, the two men spent several hours constructing a crude platform. They launched it into the river, hoping it would carry them downstream toward civilization. The river was more powerful than they had anticipated. The current swept the raft along at terrifying speed. As darkness approached, they pulled the raft to shore and tied themselves to trees to avoid being washed away during the night. Morning brought crushing disappointment. As the sun rose, they realized they had gone in a circle. The river's bend had turned them around completely. They had traveled for hours only to end up near where they started. They abandoned the raft. Over the following days, Dengler and Martin moved through the jungle on foot. Their condition deteriorated rapidly. The physical exertion combined with zero food intake accelerated starvation. They had brought small amounts of rice saved from prison rations, but this ran out after 3 days. They ate whatever they could find, berries, though they had no knowledge of which were poisonous, bamboo shoots, which caused cramping and diarrhea, insects whenever they could catch them, and snakes. Dengler became expert at catching snakes. He would spot movement, grab the snake behind the head to avoid being bitten, then kill it with a rock. The snakes were eaten raw or partially cooked over small fires when they dared make them. A small snake provided perhaps 50 to 100 calories. It was never enough. The monsoon rains began. For days, it rained constantly. The prisoners were soaked through, unable to get dry. Their skin began to break down from constant moisture. They developed tropical ulcers, open sores that wouldn't heal. Leeches attached to them constantly, dropping from trees and vegetation. Both men developed severe hallucinations. Starvation, dehydration, and disease combined to create vivid false perceptions. Dengler later described seeing his dead father appear and point him in specific directions. He saw villages that weren't there. He saw rescue helicopters that were only leaves moving in the wind. After several days of wandering, they found an abandoned village. The huts were intact, but empty. This became their base. They found some corn left in storage and rationed it carefully. They attempted to signal aircraft. C-130 flare ships flew overhead at night. Dengler and Martin tried repeatedly to signal these aircraft. They built fires. They laid out panels from their prison clothing and patterns. Nothing worked. The aircraft flew over without spotting them. Hunger eventually forced them to take greater risks. They decided they had to approach an inhabited village to find food. They saw an Aka village nearby. The accounts of what happened next are disputed and tragic. According to Dengler's testimony, Martin went in first while Dengler waited nearby. Dengler heard shouting, then saw villagers attacking Martin. Martin was killed, struck down with machetes by villagers who may have thought the emaciated figure stumbling toward them was a threat. Dengler fled. He was now completely alone. The following days blurred together. Dengler no longer tracked time reliably. He simply moved, driven by instinct and fading determination to survive. His weight dropped to approximately 85 to 98 pounds. He had weighed 157 pounds when he launched from the USS Ranger 5 months earlier. He had lost nearly 60 pounds. His body was failing systematically. The 2 strains of malaria produced near-constant fever. The intestinal worms and parasites consumed whatever minimal nutrition he found. The fungal infections covered his skin. The jaundice had turned his eyes and skin a sickly yellow, but he kept moving. He found a parachute from one of the flare drops and kept it in his rucksack, thinking it might be useful for signaling. He returned to the abandoned village where he and Martin had camped. On his 22nd day after escape, Dengler spread the parachute panels on the ground near a river, arranging them to spell out SOS. He tied another panel to a bamboo stick. Then he collapsed, too weak to move. He heard a plane. Gathering all remaining strength, he grabbed the bamboo stick with the parachute panel attached and began waving it. The plane flew past, but then it came back. The pilot wiggled the wings, the universal signal that he had seen something. Dengler began crying, shouting, rolling on his back in relief. Then he lost consciousness. July 20th, 1966. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Eugene Dietrick, commander of the 1st Air Commando Squadron, was on a routine patrol mission flying up a canyon in Laos. During a banking turn, he spotted a flash of white near the river below. He came back for another look and saw a human form waving something white. His wingman urged him to ignore it. There were no reports of recently downed American aircraft in this area. It was probably an enemy soldier attempting to lure them into a trap. But Deatrick persisted. Something about what he had seen suggested desperation rather than ambush. He radioed the command and control center, requesting they dispatch a rescue helicopter. Initially, his superiors told him to ignore the sighting. No American airmen were known to be down in the area. Deatrick insisted. He continued circling overhead, maintaining visual contact with the figure on the ground. He repeated his request for rescue forces. Finally, command authorized a helicopter to investigate. The helicopter crew approached cautiously. They too suspected this might be an enemy soldier. They lowered the tree penetrator, a device designed to pull people up through jungle canopy. Dengler, nearly delirious with fever and starvation, fumbled with the device. It took him several attempts to understand how to use it. Finally, he managed to sit on the arms and gave the signal to raise him. As he was lifted toward the helicopter, the crew prepared for possible combat. When Dengler reached the helicopter door, crew members grabbed him and immediately slammed him to the floor. They conducted a rapid strip search, looking for concealed weapons or grenades. Then a half-eaten snake fell out of Dengler's clothing. The crew stared at the snake, then at the skeletal figure on the helicopter floor. One crew member nearly fell out of the aircraft in shock. They realized this was an American. Dengler was restrained as a precaution during the flight. The helicopter crew radioed ahead that they had recovered a possible prisoner of war. Dengler managed to provide his name, rank, and unit. When they reached Da Nang, military officials confirmed his identity. Lieutenant Junior Grade Dieter Dengler, who had been declared missing in action on February 1st, 1966, had been recovered alive after 171 days. Medical examination revealed the extent of damage. Dengler weighed between 85 and 98 pounds. He had 2 distinct strains of malaria. Intestinal worms were found in his digestive system. Fungal infections covered much of his body. Jaundice indicated liver damage. Hepatitis was present. He was severely dehydrated. Doctors initially believed he would have died within 24 to 48 hours, if not rescued when he was. He was flown to the USS Ranger, the carrier from which he had launched 5 months earlier. His squadron mates were waiting. One of the first things a fellow pilot said was, "What took you so long, man?" Dengler was hospitalized for weeks. He required intravenous nutrition because his digestive system could no longer process solid food properly. Physical recovery took months. Of the 7 prisoners who escaped, only 2 survived. Pathet Lao, one of the Thai prisoners, was recaptured shortly after the escape, but survived continued captivity and was eventually rescued by Laotian troops. The other 5 prisoners were never seen alive again. Eugene was reportedly recaptured and held in another camp until 1968, then disappeared. He was never returned. YC. To disappeared into the jungle and was never heard from again. Prasit Promsuan and Prasit Thani were never found, presumed to have died in the jungle. Dwayne Martin was killed during the escape attempt. His body was never recovered. Dengler received the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor. He also received the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and the Air Medal. 171 days from shoot down to rescue, February 1st, 1966 to July 20th, 1966. 149 days in captivity, February 1st to June 29th. 23 days evading in the jungle after escape. June 29th to July 20th. Weight loss, approximately 59 pounds. From 157 pounds to 98 pounds or less. Caloric intake during captivity, approximately 100 to 150 calories daily. Less than 10% of required nutrition. Of 7 prisoners who escaped, 2 survived. Only Dengler was never recaptured. 171 days that tested the absolute limits of human endurance. One man's journey from Navy pilot to prisoner to survivor. The story of Dieter Dengler. 171 days that tested the absolute limits of human endurance. One man's journey from Navy pilot to prisoner to survivor. The story of Dieter Dengler.